On this solve, Shubham starts with an R rotation and does yellow V. First, he solves this yellow center, then he brings up this yellow red edge, then he rotates and brings that down to make a bar, and then he brings this center down to solve it, and then he inserts this yellow green edge with the 3 mover, and then he rotates and does L4E like this. So on this solve, you probably should not have started with the V on front, because then you had to rotate twice throughout your solve when this could have been rotationless. Or another way you could have done it is after you solved this center, when you brought up this edge, you could have done a U move, which it looked like you were thinking about doing a U move, but then you decided to rotate. However, if you did a U move here, to do this R move, you could do it L wide, which would save you a rotation and you wouldn't have to regrip as much. So then you could have just done the rest of your solve like that. So for this L4E case that you got, there's a slightly better alg. Not that your alg was bad, that's completely fine to use. However, from this specific AUF, there's a slightly better alg where all you do is do an insert into this L4E case, which you can actually cancel into it. So like that, and that saves you 1 move. So your V was 7 moves, which is kind of a lot, and you want to try keeping it under 6, except in some scenarios. But for this case, it wasn't really a great scramble. It was a 10 move optimal scramble, which is pretty rare. But one solution you could have seen is this green V, and so you can solve this green red edge and this green blue edge on this center like this. So you can bring down this center and then pair up this green and red edge, and that also brings this green and blue edge in place. So when you solve this center like that, you can pair up all of them, and then it also gives you a sledge, and that's also 10 moves, which is optimal on this scramble. Some other notes on this scramble is I think that you did not one-look your V, which you really should be doing. There's really no excuses at this point for not one-looking your V. I mean, all you had to track is just 2 pieces like that. So that's why when you rotated, you kind of paused for a little bit before you inserted this and started on your L4E. So you don't need to one-look the whole solve yet. Just try to start one-looking your V, and also try to look for more optimal Vs. On this scramble, Shubham does yellow V. He starts with the yellow V on right, which is not something I recommend. So you always want to do them. You always want to do your Vs on the bottom or sometimes on the front, where you can easily rotate to it on the bottom, but doing on the left and right isn't really a good idea. So what you did here was you solved this yellow red edge with this yellow red center like that, and then you did a L prime at L wide, and then an R wide prime. And here I think you got kind of confused because you kind of just did like that before you inserted this yellow green edge to solve the V, and then you just had a sledge. Your V was 8 moves, and like I said earlier, you did it on the right, which isn't great. However, the same moves that you started off with, you could have done a better V. So when you solved this yellow red center and yellow red edge like that, you could have brought over this yellow blue edge here, so that when you bring it down, you can just make the V, and then you get a pretty nice L3E case. Another note about this scramble is your tips. So your tips were mostly fine, except for the last tip. You did like a U prime to solve it, when you could have just done a U. I know you kind of got nervous, is what I'm assuming. However, you really want to eliminate this in your solves because it makes a lot of difference. Something I recommend is maybe try solving all your tips at the beginning, or do 2 at the beginning and 2 at the end. Or if you can like try to do tips while you do another move. However, that's a little bit more difficult at your level, so I would recommend trying one of those 2 things I mentioned. On the scramble, Shubham does blue V, and he solves it with the V on front, and he brings this red-blue edge, matching it with the center, and bringing the center down to create this bar. And when he did those moves, when he brought this down, this yellow-blue edge comes down with it, so then he can do that. Then he rotates and does that. However, I think a better execution for this V would have been like that, doing it on bottom, doing it here, and then rotating. It's not bad, but I think just doing this is faster. And that solution was actually fine. It wasn't as optimal, but you can execute it pretty fast. So, yeah. On the scramble, Shubham does yellow V, and he brings this bar there, and then he just does that to solve the center. Then he rotates and does a hedge and ao5. So your solution was 10 moves, and you also did it with the V on front, and then you had to rotate. But on this scramble, there was a really easy green V that you could have done where you just solve this like that, and then you just bring this center up, solve that edge, and bring it down, and then you just have a 3-move insert, and you can do that in 8 moves. Other than that, I think this solve was mostly fine. Your turning wasn't as bad, so yeah. On this solve, Shubham does blue, and he solves it by bringing this green-blue edge down there, and then he moves out of the way, brings the center back up, solves that, and solves that, then he rotates, and he didn't know this L4E, so he kind of like fumbled and did something, like I think like that eventually. The way you solve this L4E case is pretty simple. You want to hold it like this so that you can solve this green-yellow edge in 3 moves with an R, U prime, R prime, and then do a U prime, and you just have a 3-move insert. So looking at the V, he did it kind of weird. He held it on the front again, and he went like that, and then he did like a really bad rotation. He had to like do that, which I don't recommend doing. So some alternative solutions that you could have done are on yellow. There's a pretty, this one's a little harder to see, but if you did, you can solve this edge and this edge, but you have to get this center over here. So you can do that in 3 moves, and then bring that over, and then just solve those. And that also gives you, that solves the red-green, so then you just have a 4-mover. Another thing you can do on red, which is basically the same solution just from a different angle, is you solve red-yellow like that to bring this center down. So now you can put the red-yellow edge here, and then the red-green edge is here, so you can bring that down, and now you just have that. And a nice thing about this solution is it's a lower amount of moves than what you did, and it's also rotationless. So some tips I have for you for improving are definitely one-looking your V. It's really important. It'll help your solves a lot to know like what moves to do before you do them. And then you don't have to one-look L4E yet. That's more advanced. Even I don't do that always, but so yeah. Another thing is solving your V on the bottom. Solving it on the front might be easier for the short run, but for the long run, solving it on bottom is going to be a lot faster because you don't have to rotate as much. And doing, when you're advanced, you don't have to rotate at all if you solve your V on bottom, because you can do ML4E algs. And another tip I have is block building. So since you're not one-looking your Vs right now, it's kind of hard to block build. But once you start being able to do that, you'll probably find more optimal Vs. So like 3, 4, 5 movers. And also you need to be able to solve your tips better. So you kind of fumbled with your tips a good amount during your solves. And I think if you knew where your tips were going to be while you're solving, so whether you wanted to solve them all at the beginning or You want to solve 2 at the beginning, 2 at the end. Just know where your tips are going to be in inspection. So if you're going to rotate, know that those tips are going to be there. So yeah, just have a plan for your tips.